Hikers, campers and hunters of Reddit. What is the most creepy, unexplained thing you've experienced in the wild? Went camping with two friends back in 2011. At the time I lived in a rural area which is pretty much in the border of the Amazon jungle. We set up camp under some mango trees near a deserted road and take the first day to explore our surroundings. Night comes and it starts to rain. One of my friends forgot his tarp back home, and since his tent wasn't waterproof we had to share mine. We wake up in the night hearing a calf cry. Sure, there were some properties nearby and it wasn't that uncommon that the cattle would roam around.
Then we paid attention.
Whatever was making that noise was directly above us.
It was coming from up the mango tree.
TLDR, went camping in the middle of nowhere. Got spooked by spider cattle. Around a year ago my buddy was having a birthday party for his daughter in a park near us. The whole family was there. Good time. After a bit we decided to go off in the woods to hike to where a fort had been when we were kids. This was in a chunk of woods that was still pretty big but surrounded by highway and roads on all sides. Anyway, we hike a bit in and my friend stops dead in his tracks.
He just points forward.
Do you see that? That lady floating? Quote. We all looked and saw. From our view it really did look like someone levitating off the ground.
We got closer and
realized what was really going on. A lady had hung herself in the woods.
And it didn't seem long ago by the looks of it.
After getting ourselves together,
we called the police.
They came out and found the lady's car parked on the other side of the park. Door still open. She had done it that day.
Maybe hours prior.
I've seen some messed up stuff, but that will always take the cake. Still to this day it gives me chills just thinking about it. I was living in Brazil and a friend and I decided to do a one night out and back through mountainous rainforest terrain in one of the southern states. We mostly wanted to get some exercise and do a gear shakeout before going on a longer trip in Patagonia. The experience started out really tough. We were doing almost constant climbing and it was hot. Humidity was near 100%.
Through lush vegetation.
Eventually, we were pretty much in clouds and completely drenched from sweat and humidity. It was kind of hellish, soaked to the bone with no chance of drying out. Fortunately, at that altitude it gets below freezing frequently at night, so there weren't many insects or animals. Only birds. We hiked for probably 8 hours with little progress. It was slow going through tough terrain. At early evening we came to a flat spot, the first we'd seen in hours, and decided to make camp as it was starting to pour.
I basically made camp in several inches of standing water.
I was beat anyways, so I just sat in my tent reading. Around 3 a.m. I woke to a girl singing in the distance. The singing kept coming closer, until she was singing right at our tents. She pushed past us and the singing drifted off. She was singing, maybe a lullaby,
or children's song,
about rain, in Portuguese, but it sounded very strange.
An hour later,
I got woken up to the singing in the distance again.
She was coming back towards us, singing the same rain song.
As she passed us, I could hear a little exasperation in her voice. She continued singing and went back in the direction of the trailhead.
Another hour later,
I was again woken up by her singing as she was again coming back towards us. Except now she was also crying. She continued to cry and sing as she moved past us for the final time. We woke up that morning, looked at each other,
said, "What the fuck was that?"
Quote, and then got on our way. It was very eerie at the time, and I don't have an explanation for it. We were in an extremely isolated location and the trail was definitely only used by recreational hikers. So I really can't say why this woman was out wandering, singing,
and crying.
At 3 a.m., my old man was an avid outdoorsman in the Colorado Rockies in the late 80s. He'd go on week-long treks with his buds. One summer they'd been out for a few days in Pikes National Forest. They set up camp in a ravine they thought was safe. That night my dad unzipped the tent to take a leak in the dark, and outside stood a pair of pale, bare feet. My dad screamed and zipped up the tent. Everyone else woke up and asked what was wrong. My dad said someone was barefoot out there. They went out and flashed their lights for a bit, hollering. My dad swore he saw what he saw and described the feet in detail. They were old blotchy feet. One even had a lump on the ankle. Tony, his bud, asked which foot, left or right. My dad said it was the right. Then Tony said they needed to move their camp immediately. Dad asked why. Tony said they didn't have time. They went along with it and packed up and moved on top of the hill. The next morning they woke up to find a flash flood had torn through the ravine during the night. It would have surely killed them. Tony's grandfather had just died a month prior, and one of the last things he said to him was that he would always watch over him. The feet my dad described reminded Tony of his grandfather's very feet. My dad is highly religious. Supernatural or not, someone's visions of paranoia saved their lives that night. I went camping in southeast Ohio once with my dad and sister, miles from civilization. As it started to get dark, my dad and I started to prep food for the fire while my sister went to change in her tent. A couple minutes later she walks over to me and asks, "Were you outside my tent?" I asked her why, and she tells me that someone walked out from the direction of the trees to her tent and placed their hand on the wall of the tent. She smacked the hand away thinking it was me fucking with her, but when she came out no one was there. We tell my dad and he says he did it and left it at that. The problem there was I knew it wasn't him because I was with him the whole time. Later that night I asked him why. He lied. He told me it was too late to go home, so there's no sense in scaring my sister when there's nothing to do about it. I stayed in my sister's tent that night with a knife in hand and didn't sleep. We stayed for another night without incident, but I couldn't get my mind off of the fact that we weren't alone. Out in the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, I could hear this strange music way in the distance. It didn't sound like any instrument, but it wasn't quite natural either. I never did figure out what it was. It lasted only a minute or so. We were miles from civilization. I was camping in California, and over the hill I saw a large red flash and streak of light fall over the hills. I have seen meteors before, but this seemed more intense. I told my parents what I saw, but they did believe me. I have this nifty little hammock tent thingy that I camp. It's a canvas hammock with a weatherproof shell that you can't see out of. In one time, one of the flaps to my hammock just started going crazy like a cat was pawing it away. They do it doors they want out of, so I play it off as the wind, but then realize there's no wind, so I just go try and close my eyes, and it happens again 2 minutes later. So this time I think to myself, it's probably a raccoon, and I smack the side of my tent, and then all of a sudden I hear some heavy ass footprints running away after I smack my tent. That was one of the closest times I had come to shitting myself, so I just keep laying there for like an hour before coming to the conclusion that whatever was bugging me is gone. I fall asleep. Next morning when I wake up and look around and see some weird looking footprints, like mini bear tracks would be the closest I can think of, but the weird part is they're only around my hammock and there's no tracks leading up to my tent, but there's tracks leading away. Still don't know what that shit was, but I only stayed at that site for one night. I went camping for a weekend with my best friend and her dad when we were about 15 or so. On the last night there, I woke up in the middle of the night. It must have been 3 a.m. or later. I didn't check the time because there was someone walking. You could hear the soft, crunchy rustle of pine needles. It had the pace and sound of a large person. The footsteps walked straight to the tent that me and my best friend were in and just stopped. I couldn't see a shadow. or silhouette, but I wasn't sure if that was because the moonlight was just at a different angle. I thought I was going to die. My best friend turned out to have heard it too. Who was staring at me? We never heard footsteps leave. We would have heard it because we stayed awake until the sun came up. No footsteps, walking away, and no shadow. We didn't get out until we heard her dad wake up and start setting up the campfire again. Then we ran out and started screaming and crying.
We both confirmed with each other what we heard and saw.
She looked for the shadow also, but there was nothing. Her dad looked around the entire campsite and didn't find a single thing out of place. It was very weird. The freakiest thing was thinking that something could have stood outside the tent, observing us somehow. It definitely felt like it knew we knew it was there, if there was anything at all.
TLDR.
Heard footsteps come out of the woods and stand next to the tent, but nothing walked away. I love to camp and hike and hunt, but this isn't actually my story. I grew up in the Rockies, and my dad and his best friend would go camping a lot. They were business partners, so sometimes after a rough week at work, they would load up a truck and disappear for a couple days. One very snowy weekend, they just died and went way up in the mountains. They didn't take a tent, but instead built a lean-to with a tarp so the heat from their fire would get caught underneath and keep them warm, way warmer than a tent. When they woke up the next morning, there were mountain lion tracks in the snow all around their campsite, and a few just inches from where their heads were laying.
They came home early.